America's most cherished rights, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, all of those have their roots in Great Britain, but in Britain itself, those rights are dying out. Tommy Robinson is a journalist and a political activist there. One of Robinson's chief causes is raising awareness about sexual abuse, grooming, and rape committed in his country by immigrants, mostly from the Islamic world. Those crimes are ones that local authorities have ignored in order to avoid being called bigoted. Last year, Robinson attempted to cover a gang rape trial involving several Muslim men in Canterbury. For that, he was arrested, given a suspended jail sentence, and told not to cover any further trials. Undeterred, this past weekend, he performed a live stream outside a sexual abuse grooming trial in Leeds. In a free country, of course, anybody ought to be able to say what they think on a public street, but Britain is not a free country anymore. So in a matter of hours, Robinson was arrested, tried and convicted, and sentenced to 13 months in jail. That was fine, by the way, with most members of the press there and here. The judge further barred the British media from even reporting on Robinson's imprisonment, too. That ban was only lifted yesterday, 4 days after he went behind bars. And that, too, was fine with most journalists in Great Britain and here. They said virtually nothing about it, amazingly. Katie Hopkins is a columnist with Rebel Media. We talked to her about this earlier. Katie, am I misstating this? I mean, it sounds, and I know the pretext for this is that he was interfering with jurors, but he was speaking his views on a public street when he was arrested and convicted immediately and sentenced to over a year in prison. Am I mischaracterizing that?
You're not at all. That's exactly what happened. He was outside the court. He was reporting on the trial of a grooming gang, as I would call it, a rape squad. It's a cause, as you rightly say, that he's believed in for so many years. And he's one of those people who's been calling this out relentlessly, despite all of the slurs that are made against him. And yet, within 5 hours, he was arrested, he was tried, and he was sent to prison for 13 months. And none of us were allowed to talk about it, write about it, mention it, because there was also a ban on any of the media speaking about it.
Well, that's the part I don't understand.
These are very dark times in the UK. It's a very curious feeling in this country at the moment. And I would say the country is on a knife edge. There is a real sense now that we are against our own government, that the establishment is working against us, and in order to cleanse voices it doesn't like, it will put them inside for as long as it needs to shut them up.
That's horrifying. I don't know, I'll be honest, anything really about Tommy Robinson. I don't care. I don't know what he believed. It doesn't matter. He was saying what he thinks in public.
Take that, Tucker. I don't know Tommy either. I'm not a colleague of his. I'm not. I don't work with him. Many people say he's an idiot, and in some ways I concur.
So what?
He's been told not to report at these trials, and yet he's still there reporting. He didn't go with his lawyer or solicitor. You know, he knew he was going to get into trouble. But then I say to myself, even if you don't like the guy, even if you don't know the guy, surely there's some fundamental principles like,
yes,
where was the swift justice for the victims of the grooming gangs? Where was the swift justice for the 11-year-old that was raped? If we can get Tommy in prison within 5 hours, where was the swift justice for these men? And where was the swift justice for the victims? And I would also say, no matter what you think of Tommy, whether you hate him, love him, don't know him, throwing him in prison when he is a guy who's repeatedly called out majority Pakistani grooming gangs, rape squads, that is a death sentence for Tommy Robinson. And we may criticize, our government may criticize the Russians, like for getting rid of Skripal and other spies they no longer want in our country. But our government knows if they put Tommy Robinson inside, as they have done, and if he is put on an open wing, he will not survive his time inside. So I don't see how we're any different from the Russians. If this is how we're going to cleanse people that speak out against the establishment, these are dark times.
Where are the media? Where are the media in this? I mean, so again, you don't have to like this guy or know anything about him to understand what's at stake here, which is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. Why would media outlets in Great Britain go along with this gag order? Why didn't they just defy it? Go ahead and arrest us all. If this isn't a civil rights issue, then what is a civil rights issue?
Well, this is where we divide, Tucker, into right and wrong, good and bad. And I have to say, I feel like the majority of mainstream media right now in the UK is on the side of the bad. It is more important for them to be seen as multicultural and accepting and welcoming to our Muslim colleagues and our friends than it is to stand up for what we know is right. So it suits them much better to say, well, no, Tommy Robinson is an idiot. He was told not to be there at the court. He was still there at the court. And the law is in every sense justified to throw him inside. And they're celebrating, just as they're celebrating with Roseanne. But actually, what we have to ask ourselves is, what happened to freedom of speech in the UK? Because I firmly believe, and it's my opinion, we no longer have freedom of speech in the UK. And I believe Tommy Robinson will be killed inside the prison, and it will be the establishment that have blood on their hands.
Everybody watching this should be horrified. This is a threat not only to your rights, but to the rights of every American. Our rights derive from the British system. This may be a glimpse into our future. We should fight back as hard as we can. Thank you very much, Katie Hopkins, for that.
Thank you, Tucker.
Well, progressivism, not just in this country, but around the world, is increasingly coming to resemble not just a religion, but a cult bent on suicide. Not overstating that. In Europe, billionaire George Soros recently said that European countries ought to cope with migrant crises, the ones that he helped encourage, by keeping their borders open to new arrivals and then taking on tens of billions of dollars in new debt, as if they don't have enough, to fund aid to developing countries. Meanwhile, in Oakland, California, the First Congregational Church is urging its members not to call the police ever, no matter what the problem is, for the stated purpose of protecting non-whites in the congregation from police violence. Nigel Farage once led the UK Independence Party, and he joins us now. Nigel, thanks for coming on. I wanted to ask you about this because you have an international perspective, and I don't think these trends are just American. I mean, I think these impulses are sort of shared by a lot of the people in charge of the world, the West.
Yeah.
And one of the driving impulses seems to be masochism or the desire to destroy our civilization, even suicidal in some cases. But the idea that you're not allowed to defend yourself seems to undergird a lot of what we're seeing. Have you noticed this?
Yes, not just yourself, but in fact the whole shape of society. I mean, George Soros' Open Society Foundation, which he, of course, has poured billions of dollars into. I mean, this is the biggest political campaigning organization in the world. He wants to break down the fundamental values of our society. And in the case of Europe, he doesn't want Europe to be based on Christianity. Now, all of this, whether it's Soros or some of those very strange people in California, all of it is based on some kind of self-loathing, some sort of guilt trip about the past. And in Soros's case, it's a guilt trip, of course, about America's, Germany's wartime actions, the way the Jews were treated. In America, in many cases, it's how the native Indians were treated. It's all based on guilt, but it's not based on reality. I have to say, in the case of Soros, the bosses in Brussels will be furious with his timing. Right now, we have Italy in revolt because the new government, or the attempted new government, wants to get rid of 500,000 illegal migrants, and Soros appears to be going ever so slightly mad.
Right. I mean, look, I would say that there are a lot of sins that we collectively have committed as a society, as a civilization, obviously. But I sort of wonder, can we continue if those sins so shake our faith in ourselves that we refuse to defend ourselves? I mean, the church in Oakland that we described in the intro is encouraging its members not to call police even when they feel they need the police. I mean, if that's not a suicidal impulse, what is it?
Oh, no, I mean, look, there are many European cities now where the total failure of our political class to defend our Judeo-Christian culture, which actually underpins our whole society, is in many ways what's opened the doors to Islamic extremism. So we are engaged in some very, very dangerous policies here. The good news, though, is that voters are rebelling. Brexit, Trump, the recent Italian elections, the victory of Viktor Orban in Hungary, whatever these people say, ordinary people, real people, those that pay their taxes, obey the law, and go to work, they want none of this.
I wonder why the Eastern Europeans don't seem quite as guilty as the West. Is it because they suffered for so long under the Soviets?
Oh, look, they suffered in many cases under Nazism and, of course, under the Soviets. And,
Right.
it's not until
That's
1990, Tucker, that these countries were actually free Western democracies. And they do. I think it's important to realise that the church plays a much bigger role in society in Poland and Hungary than
That's
it does
right.
in France and Germany.
That's really smart. Nigel Farage, thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you.